December 17th, 1944. The sky over Leyte Island hung heavy with monsoon clouds, the air thick with the smell of aviation fuel and cordite. Major Richard Bong climbed into the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning for what would be his final combat mission. Below him, the Philippine jungle stretched endlessly, concealing both American forces pushing northward and Japanese defenders fighting with the desperation of the doomed. Bong's hands moved with practiced efficiency across the controls, checking fuel mixture, prop pitch, magnetos. The twin Allison engines roared to life, their distinctive sound a comfort after 2 years of combat. He was hunting his 40th kill. Somewhere over the Pacific, German aces Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn were compiling kill counts that would dwarf anything the Americans could achieve. Hartmann would finish the war with 352 confirmed victories. Barkhorn 301. These men were legends, their names whispered with equal parts admiration and dread. But they would never face the quiet farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin. The war had split into separate theaters, separate worlds. The Germans fought their war in the European skies. Bong fought his in the Pacific. And in that distant, steaming theater, he would become something the Luftwaffe aces never anticipated. America's deadliest fighter pilot. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of Richard Bong begins not in the cockpit of a fighter plane, but in the soil of northern Wisconsin. Born September 24, 1920, in Superior, Wisconsin, he was the eldest of 9 children born to Carl Bong, a Swedish immigrant who had crossed the Atlantic as a young boy, and Dora Bryce, Wisconsin-born and practical. The Bong family farm in Poplar sat in a landscape of endless forests and bitter winters, a place where survival required hard work and harder resilience. Population 400, 1 main street, a Lutheran church, a school. Richard, everyone called him Dick, grew up with mud on his boots and calluses on his hands. He milked cows before dawn, hauled hay in summer, helped his father repair equipment that constantly broke down. There was nothing romantic about farm life, nothing that suggested this boy would one day rule the skies of the Pacific. He was good at sports, playing baseball, basketball, and hockey for the local high school. He played clarinet in the school band, sang in the church choir on Sundays. He hunted and fished with his younger siblings. He was, by all accounts, thoroughly ordinary, except for one thing. He was obsessed with airplanes. In 1928, when Dick was 8 years old, President Calvin Coolidge established a summer White House in Superior while vacationing in the area. Every day, a mail plane would fly over the Bong farm, delivering correspondence to the president. Dick would stop whatever he was doing, stand in the field, and watch that plane pass overhead. It flew right over our house, he would later recall, and I knew then that I wanted to be a pilot. He spent hours building model airplanes, his small room cluttered with balsa wood and glue, dreaming of the day he could fly something real. But flying required money, and the Bongs had little to spare. The Great Depression hit rural Wisconsin hard. Farms failed, banks collapsed. Young men left for the cities, looking for work that didn't exist. Dick stayed, helping his family survive, but the dream of flying never left him. In 1938, after graduating 10th in his high school class of over 400 students, he enrolled at Superior State Teachers College. His plan was practical, unambitious. Become a teacher, earn a steady paycheck, help support his family. Then he discovered the Civilian Pilot Training Program. Established by the federal government in 1938 as war clouds gathered over Europe, the CPTP aimed to create a reserve of civilian pilots who could be rapidly mobilized if America entered the conflict. Dick enrolled immediately, using the program to take flying lessons in a Piper J3 Cub. He paid for additional private lessons with money saved from odd jobs, and in the air, something changed. The quiet farm boy who rarely drew attention to himself became someone else entirely. He had a natural feel for the aircraft, an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that couldn't be taught. His instructors noticed immediately. By age 20, Dick Bong could fly. More than that, he could fly well. On May 29, 1941, 7 months before Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Army Air Corps Aviation Cadet Program. The timing was prescient. America wasn't at war yet, but everyone knew it was coming. The German Wehrmacht had conquered Poland, France, the Low Countries. The Luftwaffe ruled European skies. In the Pacific, Japan was expanding its empire through China and Southeast Asia, its military doctrine built on aggressive offensive action. The United States military was preparing, quietly and urgently, for the war it knew was inevitable. Bong entered primary flight training at the Rankin Aeronautical Academy near Tulare, California, in June 1941. He soloed in a Stearman biplane trainer, then moved to basic training at Gardner Field near Taft, California. His performance was exceptional, so exceptional that he was selected for advanced single-engine fighter training at Luke Field near Phoenix, Arizona. One of his instructors there was Captain Barry Goldwater, who would later serve as a United States Senator from Arizona. Goldwater would remember Bong as one of the finest natural pilots he had ever encountered. On January 9, 1942, 1 month after Pearl Harbor plunged America into war, Second Lieutenant Richard Bong was commissioned in the Army Air Force Reserves and awarded his pilot wings. He was 21 years old. His first assignment should have been deployment overseas. Instead, due to his exceptional gunnery skills demonstrated in training, he was kept at Luke Field as an instructor. For 4 months, while his classmates shipped out to combat zones, Bong taught other pilots how to shoot. It must have been frustrating. The war was happening without him. In May 1942, Bong finally received his operational assignment, the 49th Fighter Squadron, 14th Fighter Group, at Hamilton Field near San Francisco. There, he would learn to fly the aircraft that would make him famous, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. The P-38 was unlike anything American pilots had flown before. Twin-engine, twin-boom, with a central nacelle housing the cockpit and armament, it looked like something from science fiction. Its twin Allison V1710 engines generated 3,200 horsepower, combined, giving it a top speed of over 400 miles per hour. Its armament was devastating. 1 20mm cannon and 4 50-caliber machine guns, all mounted in the nose, all firing straight ahead with no convergence issues. Unlike single-engine fighters, where wing-mounted guns had to be harmonized to converge at a specific distance, the P-38's nose-mounted weapons created a cone of fire that was lethal at any range. Bong loved it immediately, but his enthusiasm got him into trouble. On June 12, 1942, Bong was feeling confident, perhaps too confident. He and several other P-38 pilots decided to celebrate a fellow pilot's wedding by buzzing the man's house in San Anselmo. Bong flew so low that witnesses claimed they could see his face in the cockpit. Not content with that display, he then flew to San Francisco, looped around the center span of the Golden Gate Bridge, and buzzed down Market Street at rooftop level. On his way back to Hamilton Field, he flew over an Oakland neighborhood so low that his prop wash blew laundry off a woman's clothesline. The woman complained. General George C. Kenney, newly assigned to command of the 5th Air Force and passing through Hamilton Field en route to the Pacific, heard about the incident. He called Bong into his office. Kenney was a hard man, a veteran of World War I, not given to tolerating foolishness. Bong expected to be court-martialed. Instead, Kenney looked at him and said, "Monday morning you check this address out in Oakland, and if the woman has any washing to be hung out on the line, you do it for her. Then you hang around being useful, mowing the lawn or something, and when the clothes are dry, take them off the line and bring them into the house. And don't drop any of them on the ground or you will have to wash them all over again. I want this woman to think we are good for something else besides annoying people." "Now get out of here before I get mad and change my mind." Bong did as ordered. He showed up at the woman's house, apologized profusely, and did her laundry. The woman was reportedly charmed. More importantly, Kenny remembered him. The general saw something in the quiet Wisconsin farm boy, something beyond the reckless stunt flying. He saw raw talent, aggressive confidence, a pilot who pushed boundaries because he understood instinctively where those boundaries were. When Kenny departed for the Pacific in September 1942, he made sure Richard Bong came with him. In late August 1942, Bong shipped out to the Southwest Pacific area. His unit, the 49th Fighter Group, was based in Australia, but Bong and several other pilots were temporarily assigned to gain combat experience with the 39th Fighter Squadron, 35th Fighter Group, operating out of Port Moresby, New Guinea. Port Moresby was the last Allied stronghold on New Guinea, a vital position preventing Japanese forces from threatening Australia. The fighting there was desperate, confused, and deadly. New Guinea was hell. The jungle was impenetrable, the heat suffocating, the humidity constant. Malaria, dengue fever, and dysentery killed almost as many men as combat. Airstrips were carved out of mud and coral, often under fire, and maintained by engineers who worked around the clock to keep the runways operational. Supply lines were tenuous. Everything fuel, ammunition, food, medicine had to be flown in. Japanese bombers attacked constantly, supported by Zero fighters that were faster and more maneuverable than anything the Americans could field, except, perhaps, for the P-38. Bong flew his first combat missions in late 1942, escorting bombers and flying patrol over Allied positions. For weeks, he saw no action. The Japanese were withdrawing from some positions, consolidating in others, and air contacts were sporadic. Then came December 27th, 1942. The Battle of Bunagona was reaching its climax. Allied forces were pushing Japanese defenders back toward the coast, but the fighting was savage. Close-quarters combat in jungle so thick that artillery was useless and air support difficult to coordinate. Japanese reinforcements were attempting to reach the area by sea and air. Captain Thomas Lynch, commanding 12 P-38 seconds from the 39th Fighter Squadron, received orders to intercept a Japanese formation reported heading toward Buna. Bong was one of the 12 pilots. They found the Japanese over Buna, 40 aircraft, a mixed formation of fighters and bombers, 40 against 12. The mathematics were terrible. Lynch didn't hesitate. He led his formation into the attack. What followed was chaos. P-38 seconds and Zeros tangled at close range, the air filled with tracers and the sound of machine guns hammering at cyclic rate. Bong found himself face to face with a Mitsubishi, a 6M-0, the Japanese fighter that had terrorized Allied pilots since Pearl Harbor. The Zero was lighter, more maneuverable, capable of outturning any American fighter in a dogfight. But the P-38 had advantages: speed, firepower, and twin engines that could absorb damage that would cripple a single-engine aircraft. Bong closed in. The fundamental lesson of aerial combat, taught to every fighter pilot, is simple. Shoot first, shoot straight, and get close enough to make sure you hit. Bong got close, very close. So close that when his guns raked the Zero, he could see pieces of the aircraft disintegrating. The pilot slumped in the cockpit. The Zero rolled inverted and fell away, trailing smoke. His first kill. Minutes later, he engaged a Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar, another Japanese fighter attempting to protect the bombers. Same technique. Close in, fire a concentrated burst, watch the enemy aircraft come apart. The Oscar pilot never had a chance to evade. When the engagement ended, Lynch's squadron had shot down 12 Japanese aircraft without loss. 2 of those kills belonged to Richard Bong. For his actions that day, he was awarded the Silver Star. He was no longer a training instructor teaching other pilots how to fight. He was a fighter pilot, and he was good at it. Over the following weeks, Bong's kill count rose steadily. On January 7, 1943, he attacked a Japanese convoy attempting to reinforce Lae, New Guinea, and shot down 2 aircraft escorting the ships. The next day, January 8th, he was escorting B-24 bombers when his formation encountered approximately 20 Japanese fighters. In the ensuing battle, Bong shot down another aircraft, his 5th confirmed kill. He was officially an ace. It had taken him less than 2 weeks of combat. The speed of his success was remarkable, but what struck his fellow pilots more than the numbers was his method. Bong wasn't flashy. He didn't take unnecessary risks. He didn't chase glory. He studied each engagement, analyzed what worked and what didn't, and refined his technique accordingly. His favorite tactic was simple and brutal. Use the P-38's superior speed to dive on enemy formations from above, close to point-blank range, fire a concentrated burst, and use the diving speed to disengage before the enemy could respond. He called his gunnery lousy, claiming he had to get dangerously close because he couldn't hit anything at range. His fellow pilots knew better. Combat reports showed Bong had a hit rate of approximately 91%. He wasn't a poor shot. He was methodical, precise. He eliminated variables by closing range to the point where missing was nearly impossible. It was terrifying for the Japanese pilots. They would see a P-38 diving at impossible speed, and then their aircraft would simply disintegrate around them. No warning, no chance to evade, just sudden mechanical death. February 3rd, 1943, Bong rejoined his original unit, the 9th Fighter Squadron of the 49th Fighter Group, which had finally received its full complement of P-38 seconds. He continued flying combat missions throughout 1943, steadily accumulating kills. On March 3rd, during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, a massive Allied air and naval assault on a Japanese convoy, he shot down a 0. By midsummer, his tally stood at 15 confirmed kills. He was promoted to first lieutenant, then to captain. Throughout this period, Bong flew as part of a loose partnership with Captain Thomas Lynch, the same officer who had led the mission on December 27th, where Bong scored his first kills. Lynch was older, more experienced, and served as an informal mentor. They flew together frequently, covering each other in combat, sharing tactics and observations. Lynch's own kill count was rising in parallel with Bong's. The two men developed a quiet rivalry, pushing each other to improve, to survive, to win. But in war, survival is never guaranteed. On March 8, 1944, while attacking Japanese barges near Taji, Lynch's P-38 took critical damage. Bong watched helplessly as Lynch's aircraft, trailing smoke and losing altitude, disappeared into the jungle below. He circled the area, searching frantically for any sign of a parachute, any indication Lynch had survived. Nothing. With his own fuel running low and his aircraft damaged, Bong had no choice but to return to base. Thomas Lynch was never found. He was declared missing in action, presumed dead. The loss hit Bong hard. Friends who saw him after he landed said he looked shaken in a way they had never seen before. General Kenny, recognizing the strain, ordered Bong to take a week of rest and recovery in Australia. It was a reminder of the terrible mathematics of aerial combat. Skill and experience improved your odds, but they didn't guarantee survival. The best pilots died alongside the mediocre ones. Luck mattered as much as talent. By early April 1944, Bong had 26 confirmed kills. He was closing in on the American record, 26 aerial victories, set by Captain Eddie Rickenbacker during World War I. Rickenbacker was a legend, America's top ace from the previous war, his name synonymous with fighter pilot excellence. His record had stood for 26 years. On April 12, 1944, Bong shot down his 26th aircraft. Then, in the same mission, he shot down his 27th. He had broken Rickenbacker's record. The news spread rapidly through the 5th Air Force, then back to the United States. Suddenly, Richard Bong was famous. Newspapers ran stories about the quiet Wisconsin farm boy who had become America's deadliest pilot. Rickenbacker himself sent a message of congratulations. Generous in defeat, General Kenny promoted Bong to major and sent him back to the United States for a publicity tour. For the next several months, Bong was more celebrity than fighter pilot. He visited training bases, gave speeches, participated in war bond drives. He toured 15 states, shaking hands with politicians and reporters, posing for photographs. It was everything he hated. He was not comfortable with fame. He didn't want to be a symbol. He wanted to fly. And he wanted to go home to Wisconsin, to see his family, to visit a young woman named Marjorie Vatndal. Bong had met Marge during a brief leave in 1943. She was tall, dark-haired, strikingly beautiful, and unlike anyone he had known. They began corresponding, letters crossing the Pacific, tentative at first, then increasingly intimate. By 1944, Bong was in love. While in the United States on his publicity tour, he spent as much time as possible in Wisconsin, visiting Marge, getting to know her. He was awkward around her, shy in a way he never was in the cockpit of a P-38. But she saw past the shyness, saw the decent, determined man beneath the fame. In September 1944, Bong returned to the Pacific. He was assigned to V Fighter Command, headquarters, as an advanced gunnery instructor with explicit orders. He could fly missions to observe and evaluate other pilots' techniques, but he was not to actively engage in combat. General Kenny had decided that Bong's knowledge and experience were too valuable to risk losing in action. At 24 years old, with 27 confirmed kills, he was more useful training the next generation of fighter pilots than adding to his personal score. Bong ignored the orders. He flew combat missions anyway, justifying each one as necessary for observational purposes. When Japanese fighters appeared, he engaged them, claiming self-defense. In October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte, he shot down 2 more aircraft over Balikpapan, Borneo, then 6 more over Leyte itself, as American forces invaded the Philippines. By mid-November, his total stood at 35 confirmed kills. General Kenny was furious and impressed. Bong's willingness to disobey orders and continue flying combat missions demonstrated the exact kind of aggressive initiative that made great fighter pilots. But it also demonstrated something else. Bong needed to fly. Combat had become part of who he was. The quiet farm boy from Poplar had been transformed by 2 years of war into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. On December 12, 1944, at Tacloban Airfield in the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur personally presented Richard Bong with the Medal of Honor. MacArthur threw away his prepared remarks and spoke from the heart. Major Richard Ira Bong, who has ruled the air from New Guinea to the Philippines, I now induct you into the Society of the Bravest of the Brave, the wearers of the Congressional Medal of Honor of the United States. Bong stood at attention, uncomfortable with the ceremony, wanting it to be over. His P-38, which he had named Marge, and adorned with a photograph of Marjorie Vatndal on the nose, sat on the flight line nearby. The photograph had become famous throughout the Pacific. Other pilots painted pin-up girls on their aircraft, sexualized images meant to boost morale. Bong put a picture of the woman he loved. She looks swell, he explained to reporters who asked about it, and a hell of a lot better than these naked women painted on most of the airplanes. 5 days later, December 17th, Bong flew his final combat mission. The mission briefing was routine. American forces were consolidating their hold on Leyte, pushing Japanese defenders into the mountains where they would die slowly of starvation and disease. The 5th Air Force was tasked with maintaining air superiority, preventing Japanese reinforcements from reaching the island, and providing close air support for ground forces. Bong's mission was a standard combat air patrol over the invasion beaches. Find enemy aircraft, destroy them, return to base. He took off from Tacloban Airfield in mid-morning, leading a flight of 4 P-38 seconds. The weather was poor, Typical for the Philippine monsoon season, low clouds, intermittent rain, visibility measured in hundreds of yards rather than miles, dangerous flying conditions, but Bong had flown in worse. His formation climbed through the cloud layer, breaking into clear air at 10,000 feet, and began their patrol pattern. They didn't have to wait long. Radar vectored them toward a formation of Japanese aircraft approaching from the north, bombers escorted by fighters, attempting to strike American positions. Bong's flight dove to intercept. What happened next was recorded in the mission report filed later that day, clinical military language describing mechanized slaughter. Major Bong engaged enemy aircraft at approximately 1,045 hours. One Ki-43 Oscar destroyed. Aircraft observed to explode in mid-air. Major Bong's aircraft sustained no damage. RTB at 1,130 hours. That was it. His 40th kill. A Japanese pilot died, his aircraft disintegrated, and Richard Bong became America's ace of aces, a record that would never be broken. He flew back to Tacloban, landed, climbed out of his P-38, and filed his report. The other pilots congratulated him. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey, and they toasted his achievement. Bong accepted the praise with his characteristic quiet modesty, then returned to his quarters and wrote a letter to Marge. General Kenny made the decision that afternoon. 40 kills, 200 combat missions, over 500 hours of combat flying. It was enough, more than enough. Bong had survived impossible odds for over 2 years, and Kenny wasn't going to let him die in the war's final months. The order was simple and final. Major Richard Bong was going home. This time, it wasn't temporary. This time, it was for good. Bong arrived back in the United States in January 1945 to a level of celebrity that dwarfed his previous publicity tour. He was America's greatest fighter pilot, the man who had beaten all records, the hero who symbolized American air power. Reporters followed him everywhere. Radio shows wanted interviews. Newsreels featured him in theaters across the country. The Army Air Force paraded him around for public relations purposes, using him to sell war bonds and boost morale. He attended banquets, gave speeches, shook hands with politicians and generals and celebrities. He hated every minute of it. What Bong wanted was simple, to marry Marge Vatndal and try to build something resembling a normal life. On February 10th, 1945, they were married at Concordia Lutheran Church in Superior, Wisconsin. 1,200 guests attended the ceremony. The international press covered it as a major news event. Photographers crowded the church, flashbulbs popping, capturing every moment for the newspapers and newsreels. It was the wedding of America's hero and his sweetheart, the perfect wartime love story. For Bong and Marge, it must have felt surreal. They had known each other through letters and brief leaves, stolen moments between combat deployments. Now they were married, thrust into a spotlight neither had sought, expected to play roles in a narrative someone else had written. But they tried. They moved to California, where Bong had been assigned to Wright Field, Ohio, initially, then later to Burbank, California, where Lockheed Aircraft Corporation was developing its newest fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star. The P-80 represented the future of aerial combat. It was America's first operational jet fighter, powered not by piston engines and propellers, but by a turbojet that could push the aircraft to speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Sleek, modern, revolutionary, the P-80 would make every piston engine fighter obsolete overnight. Lockheed needed test pilots to evaluate the aircraft, to push it to its limits, to identify problems before the P-80 entered mass production. Richard Bong volunteered. He had spent 2 years flying the P-38, mastering every aspect of that aircraft's performance. The chance to fly the cutting edge of aviation technology was irresistible. In June 1945, he was assigned to Lockheed's facility in Burbank as Chief of Flight Operations and Air Force Plant Representative. The job was safe, prestigious, important. No one was shooting at him. He would test aircraft, write reports, help prepare the P-80 for combat deployment, and go home to Marge every night. The war in Europe had ended in May. Germany had surrendered, its cities in ruins, its military destroyed. The war in the Pacific continued, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. American forces were closing in on Japan itself. Massive bombing raids were reducing Japanese cities to ash. The invasion of the home islands was being planned, an operation that would dwarf D-Day and cost hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides. But that invasion was months away. For now, in the summer of 1945, Richard Bong's war was over, or so it seemed. The P-80 Shooting Star was a beautiful aircraft, but it was also dangerous. Jet engines were new technology, temperamental and prone to failure. Test pilots died regularly, killed by mechanical malfunctions, design flaws, or simple bad luck. The mortality rate for test pilots was higher than for combat pilots, a grim statistic that everyone in the field knew but rarely discussed. There was a culture among test pilots, Chuck Yeager would later write in his autobiography, of anger toward those who died. Anger instead of grief, because grief would make the job impossible. Bong had been briefed on the P-80's fuel system. The aircraft had two fuel pumps, a primary electric pump and an auxiliary manual pump. Standard procedure required the pilot to switch to the auxiliary pump during takeoff as a safety precaution. If the primary pump failed during takeoff, when the aircraft was low and slow and vulnerable, having the auxiliary pump already activated meant the engine wouldn't quit. It was a simple procedure, drilled into every P-80 pilot. Electric boost pump off, manual pump on, before takeoff. Simple, routine, critical. On the morning of August 6, 1945, Bong arrived at Lockheed's facility for a standard acceptance flight test. The P-80 he was assigned, tail number 44285048, had just completed maintenance. Bong conducted his pre-flight inspection, checking control surfaces, fuel levels, hydraulics. Everything looked normal. He climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and started the engine. The Allison J-33 turbojet spun up smoothly, the high-pitched whine building to a roar. Bong taxied to runway 15, received clearance from the tower, and pushed the throttle forward. The takeoff roll was normal. The P-80 accelerated quickly, much faster than a piston-engine fighter. Witnesses on the ground reported seeing the aircraft lift off and begin climbing. Then, at an altitude of between 300 and 400 feet, they saw puffs of black smoke from the engine. The aircraft began rolling to the right. Bong corrected, leveling the wings. The canopy separated, blown clear by the emergency release system. The aircraft was descending now, the engine clearly failing. Bong attempted to eject. In 1945, ejection seat technology was primitive. The P-80's ejection system was manually operated, requiring the pilot to jettison the canopy, release his harness, and physically push himself out of the aircraft. At low altitude, with the aircraft descending and losing speed, the procedure was marginal at best. Bong got out of the cockpit, but he was too low. His parachute had no time to deploy. He fell back toward the ground, engulfed in flames from the burning aircraft. The P-80 struck the ground in a narrow field near North Hollywood at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon, impacting in a steep nose-down attitude. The fuel explosion was immediate and massive. Witnesses ran toward the crash site, but there was nothing they could do. Major Richard Ira Bong, America's ace of aces, the man who had survived 200 combat missions and 40 aerial victories over 2 years of war in the Pacific, was dead. He was 24 years old. The investigation later determined that Bong had failed to switch from the primary fuel pump to the auxiliary pump before takeoff. When the primary pump malfunctioned during the climb, the engine lost fuel pressure and quit. Whether Bong forgot the procedure unlikely, given his methodical nature and training, or whether the mechanical linkage for the auxiliary pump was faulty and prevented him from switching pumps remains unclear. His brother Carl, who wrote a biography of Richard in 1991 titled Dear Mom, So We Have a War, examined the crash investigation reports in detail and questioned whether Bong would have made such a fundamental error so soon after being briefed on the procedure by another pilot. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The timing of Bong's death achieved a terrible synchronicity. The same day, August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. The bomb, codenamed Little Boy, detonated at approximately 8:15 in the morning Hiroshima time, killing an estimated 70,000 people instantly and condemning tens of thousands more to slow deaths from radiation poisoning. The attack marked the beginning of the end of World War II. Japan would surrender 9 days later, on August 15th. The next morning, newspapers across America ran dual headlines: the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and the death of Major Richard Bong. The Los Angeles Times devoted its entire front page to both stories, placing them side by side, the weapon that would end the war and the pilot who had come to symbolize American air power. The juxtaposition was stark and cruel. While the world's attention focused on Hiroshima and the terrifying new age of atomic warfare, America quietly mourned the loss of its greatest ace. Marge Bong learned of her husband's death while listening to the radio in their Burbank apartment. They had been married less than 6 months. She was 23 years old. The funeral was held at Concordia Lutheran Church in Superior, the same church where they had been married. Thousands of mourners attended. The streets along the 20-mile route of the funeral cortege were lined with bereaved citizens. Bong was buried in the family plot at Poplar Cemetery, in the small Wisconsin town where he had been born, surrounded by farmland and forests and the endless northern sky. General George Kenney, who had discovered Bong at Hamilton Field and mentored him throughout the war, wrote in his autobiography about receiving the news of Bong's death. Right then, I stopped thinking of the atom bomb which had wiped out Hiroshima that morning, stopped speculation about the effect of the coming entry of Russia into the Pacific War, even stopped thinking of the capitulation of Japan, which we all knew was about to take place in a few days. Wherever I landed, I found that the whole 5th Air Force felt the same, that we had lost a loved one, someone we had been glad to see out of combat and on his way home 8 months before. Kenney continued, You see, we not only loved him, we boasted about him, we were proud of him. That's why each of us got a lump in our throats when we read that telegram about his death. Major Bong, ace of American aces in all our wars, is destined to hold the title for all time. With the weapons we possess today, no war of the future will last long enough for any pilot to run up 40 victories again. Kenney was right. Richard Bong's record has never been broken. No American pilot since has achieved 40 aerial victories. The nature of aerial combat changed after World War II. The Korean War saw jet versus jet combat, but kill counts were measured in single digits. Vietnam-era pilots faced surface-to-air missiles and strict rules of engagement that limited opportunities for air-to-air combat. Modern warfare, with its beyond visual range missiles and network-centric tactics, has made the classic dogfight nearly obsolete. The age of the fighter ace, in the American military at least, ended with World War II, and Richard Bong stood at its pinnacle. But what made Bong exceptional? Why did he accumulate 40 kills when most fighter pilots never achieved 5? The answer lies not in aggression or bravado qualities celebrated in fighter pilot mythology, but in something more prosaic. Methodical precision combined with absolute tactical discipline. Bong himself claimed his gunnery was poor, but combat records contradict that assessment. His hit rate was approximately 91%, among the highest in the 5th Air Force. What he lacked, perhaps, was confidence in long-range shooting. He compensated by closing to ranges where missing was nearly impossible, sometimes as close as 50 yards, sometimes closer. He flew through the debris of exploding enemy aircraft multiple times. On one occasion, he actually collided with his target, claiming it as a probable kill. This wasn't recklessness. It was calculated risk based on intimate understanding of his aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The P-38 Lightning was perfectly suited to Bong's style. Its twin engines provided redundancy. He could lose an engine and still make it home. Its nose-mounted armament eliminated convergence issues that plagued wing-mounted gun installations. Its speed and climb rate allowed him to control engagement geometry, choosing when to fight and when to disengage. Bong studied the P-38 obsessively, mastering every aspect of its performance envelope. Fellow pilots remarked on his ability to make the aircraft do things they had thought impossible. Equally important was his tactical discipline. Many aggressive pilots died because they pursued enemies into disadvantageous positions, allowing themselves to be drawn into traps or separated from their wingmen. Bong never made that mistake. He analyzed each engagement before committing, identified the optimal attack vector, executed with precision, and disengaged immediately if the tactical situation turned unfavorable. He felt no shame in breaking off combat when outnumbered or when his aircraft was damaged. Survival, he understood, required knowing when not to fight. This approach contrasted sharply with the philosophy that produced the Luftwaffe's top aces. Erich Hartmann, with his 352 kills, flew continuously on the Eastern Front from 1942 until Germany's surrender in 1945. He flew over 1,400 combat missions. Gerhard Barkhorn flew over 1,100 missions to achieve his 301 kills. These staggering numbers reflect not just skill but also the brutal mathematics of the Eastern Front, where air combat was constant and German pilots flew until they were killed or physically incapable of continuing. The American military operated under a different doctrine. Pilots rotated home after completing a combat tour, typically 6 months to a year. This policy recognized that combat stress accumulated, that even the best pilots eventually made fatal mistakes if kept in action too long. The rotation system preserved experienced pilots, allowed them to pass their knowledge to new pilots as instructors, and prevented the complete psychological breakdown that claimed many Luftwaffe veterans in the war's final years. Bong served 3 combat tours totaling 27 months. He flew 200 combat missions in that time, far fewer than Hartmann or Barkhorn, but against opponents who were, at least in the early war years, flying superior aircraft. The Japanese Zero, in 1942 and 43, could outturn and outclimb most American fighters. Japanese pilots were experienced, many of them veterans of the China campaign. The tactical situation required American pilots to leverage their aircraft's strengths, speed, firepower, durability, against the Zero's advantages in maneuverability. Bong excelled at this kind of tactical chess. He never tried to dogfight a Zero in a turning engagement, where the Japanese fighter's superior maneuverability would dominate. Instead, he used the P-38's speed to attack from advantageous positions, high side passes, diving attacks where the Zero couldn't respond effectively. Strike fast, strike hard, disengage before the enemy could retaliate. It was warfare as engineering problem, solved through analysis and execution rather than intuition and aggression. Yet there was a cost to this efficiency, a psychological weight that Bong rarely discussed, but that emerges in scattered accounts from those who knew him. Thomas Lynch, his mentor and friend, was killed in combat in March 1944. Other pilots Bong flew with died. Some shot down in combat, some lost to mechanical failure, some simply missing, their aircraft disappearing over the Pacific without trace. The casualty rate among fighter pilots was staggering. Squadrons lost half their pilots in 6 months. The men who survived developed coping mechanisms, dark humor, emotional detachment, drinking anything to manage the constant awareness that today's mission might be the last. Bong's coping mechanism appears to have been work. He flew constantly, analyzed each mission, refined his techniques, and flew again. His letters home to his family and to Marge were matter-of-fact, describing missions in clinical terms, rarely acknowledging the emotional reality of killing or the fear that must have accompanied every takeoff. His fellow pilots remembered him as quiet, focused, not given to the boisterous camaraderie common in fighter squadrons. He was friendly but reserved, professional but distant. This emotional restraint may explain why Bong remains less famous than other World War II figures. He didn't fit the archetype of the fighter ace, swaggering, aggressive, charismatic. He was none of those things. He was a farm boy from Wisconsin who happened to be extraordinarily good at aerial combat, who did what was asked of him with methodical efficiency, and who wanted nothing more than to go home. The media struggled to romanticize someone so fundamentally unromantic. How do you mythologize competence? How do you turn precision into legend? Yet his record speaks for itself. 40 confirmed kills, 200 combat missions, 500 hours of combat time, the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star with oak leaf cluster, the Distinguished Flying Cross with 7 oak leaf clusters, the Air Medal with 15 oak leaf clusters, awards from Australia recognizing his service in defending that country when Japanese invasion seemed imminent. Richard Bong was, by any objective measure, the most successful American fighter pilot in history, and he died testing a jet fighter in California, killed by a fuel pump malfunction, on the same day the atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima. The irony is almost unbearable. Bong survived everything the Japanese military threw at him for 2 years. He fought through the desperate early days of the Pacific War when Japan seemed unstoppable. He flew in weather that grounded less skilled pilots. He faced enemy aces, anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failures, and the simple chaos of aerial combat, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. He survived all of it. And then, in the safety of Southern California, flying a routine test flight in clear weather, he died. The ultimate irony, perhaps, is that Bong didn't need to be flying that day. He could have stayed home with Marge. He could have declined the test, pilot assignment. He had done enough. No one would have questioned his decision to step back, to let someone else fly the experimental jets. But he chose to fly. The quiet farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, who had never sought fame or glory, couldn't stay away from the cockpit. Flying had become who he was. Eddie Rickenbacker, whose World War I record Bong had broken, wrote after Bong's death, "Major Bong was a boy in years, a modest, unassuming boy who, in demeanor and aspect, could well serve as a model for the ideal American lad. But in the performance of duty, in his ability to assume and carry out tasks beyond the call of that duty, he was poised, mature, and gallant as that renowned mirror of knighthood, of whom it was said he was a perfect warrior, without fear and without reproach." The assessment was generous, but accurate. Bong had been transformed by the war, shaped by 2 years of combat into something different from the boy who had left Wisconsin in 1942. The war made him America's deadliest pilot, but it couldn't make him comfortable with what he had become. He was a killer, efficient, methodical, extraordinarily successful, who wanted nothing more than to stop killing. His survival, when so many others died, must have weighed on him. Why him? Why had he made it home when Tommy Lynch hadn't? When hundreds of other pilots, some more skilled, some more experienced, had died in burning aircraft over the Pacific? There's no answer to that question, of course. Survival in combat is never purely about skill. Luck matters. Being in the right place at the right moment, or the wrong place at the wrong moment, can determine everything. Bong was lucky, until he wasn't. And his death, coming in the war's final days, in a routine test flight, feels like a cosmic joke, a final demonstration that in war nothing makes sense, nothing is fair, and the price of survival is sometimes paid in full just when safety seems assured. Today, Richard Bong is remembered through monuments and memorials scattered across the United States and beyond. The Richard Bong State Recreation Area occupies the site of what was to be Bong Air Force Base in Kenosha County, Wisconsin. The Richard I. Bong Memorial Bridge spans the connection between Duluth, Minnesota, and Superior, Wisconsin, carrying thousands of vehicles daily. The Richard I. Bong Airport serves his hometown of Superior. The Richard I. Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior preserves his legacy, displaying a refurbished P-38 Lightning and extensive exhibits documenting not just Bong's life, but the experiences of all World War II veterans. These memorials serve a purpose beyond remembering one man. They remind us of what that generation accomplished, the price they paid, and the world they preserved through their sacrifice. Richard Bong was one man among millions who served, but his story encapsulates larger truths about war, heroism, and the cost of survival. He was never comfortable being called a hero. "We're just doing our job," he would say when pressed about his achievements. It was a farm boy's answer, practical and unassuming, but it was also true. Bong did his job with exceptional skill for 2 years of brutal combat. He survived when survival seemed impossible. He came home, and then, in a final, terrible irony, he died doing the job he loved, killed by a mechanical failure that had nothing to do with enemy action or the courage that had carried him through the war. The German aces never heard his name. They were too busy fighting their own war, compiling their enormous kill counts in the skies over Russia and Germany. In another world, perhaps Bong would have faced them, P-38 against Messerschmitt or Fokker-Wulf, American efficiency against German aggression, but that meeting never happened. The war split the world, and they fought in different theatres, against different enemies, under different rules. What remains is the record. 40 confirmed kills, the highest of any American pilot in any war, a standard that has stood for nearly 8 decades and will likely stand forever. Behind that number is a young man from a small Wisconsin town who loved flying, who married the woman he loved, and who died doing what he had learned to do better than anyone else. On August 6, 1945, the world changed. The atomic bomb demonstrated that warfare had entered a new, terrifying age where entire cities could be destroyed in seconds. And on that same day, in a field near North Hollywood, California, the old age of warfare died too. The age of individual courage, of dogfights and aces, of pilots like Richard Bong who ruled the skies through skill and determination. He was America's ace of aces, and he died on the day the world learned that aces no longer mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.